At 10:30. I'm going to introduce myself. I am the newest co-director of the Institute for Law Teaching and Learning. I'm a faculty member here at Bowen. I've been asked to make a couple of announcements this morning and then introduce a couple of people to you. I think Kelly has sent out some really very clear instructions, but I know things can get lost during this time. We have 3 plenary sessions. Those each have separate Zoom links, and each of those will be recorded and placed on our website at the conclusion of the conference. We then have 2 tracks of concurrent classes. There's the odd number track and the even number track. Don't feel like you need to get stuck in one of those tracks, but we will just have the Zoom links open all day for those tracks. Kelly Terry and Emily Grant will be facilitating the odd number classes, and Sandra Simpson and I will be facilitating the even number even number classes. So if you have any problems with those, let us know. I think those are all my announcements. It is now my pleasure to introduce our dean here at Bowen, Terry Beiner. Dean Beiner has really led by example this year in many ways. One of the things that she's done that is incredibly impressive to me is that she taught a 1L class of about 120 students, and she did it in a hybrid format. So she knows of what she speaks, and we are grateful for her support. Terry?
Thank you, Lindsay. And for those of you who don't know this, you can see her name on that, but that actually was Lindsay Gustafson, who's our Associate Dean for Academic Affairs here at the law school. She's my backup right-hand person for all occasions. So thank you, Lindsay, for that introduction. I want to, on behalf of the faculty and staff of the University of Arkansas at Little Rock Bowen School of Law, welcome to the Summer 2021 conference for the Institute for Law Teaching and Learning. Bowen, along with our partner, the Washburn University School of Law, is happy to host you all today and hopefully have a really good day of learning about a theme that is all near and dear to our heart, effective instruction online, hybrid, and in-person learning environments. I don't know if you are like us, but we literally transitioned to online in an hour. We had 1 case of COVID in Arkansas, and I thought I was going to have a week. I'm going to tell you my story. On a Wednesday morning, I was in a dean's council and was told I probably had a week before I needed to transition to an online system. I had already set up with my IT people training for my faculty to get them online the following Monday. And then the next day, Arkansas had its first COVID case, and we went online in an hour. 3 o'clock in the afternoon, our chancellor sent out an email, and my evening classes that day went online. So it was a pretty amazing transition and an amazing learning experience over the past year. I think we've gotten better at this, but we still have a lot to learn. So I'm really happy with the theme of this conference, and I'm hoping that a lot will be learned by everybody who's participating. I'm also happy to see such a wide variety of professors here today. We have folks from both coasts and in between, so welcome. And again, I hope this is a very productive time for you, and I'm glad that we're going to be recording these sessions for future reference by other folks who couldn't make it today. So thank you all for being here, and again, welcome.
Thank you, Terry. It is now my pleasure to introduce our plenary speaker. Amanda Nolen is our colleague here at the University of Arkansas at Little Rock. She's a professor with the School of Education. I'm going to tell you her background in a minute, but I want to tell a story about her first. The way that Amanda and I got connected, I was writing an article on assessment a few years ago, and I had done a ton of reading. And my initial efforts to reach out to Amanda were so narrow and so uninformed that she had a very difficult time even understanding what my questions were. She was very patient with me. She spent time with me. She met with me and was very generous with her expertise. And we're thrilled that she's doing that for all of us today. Dr. Nolen has her PhD in educational psychology from Baylor. Her research includes the motivational consequences of academic feedback, academic motivation in marginalized student populations, and developing methodological guidelines in researching academic motivation and belonging in academic medicine, engineering education, and science education. We are very grateful to have Dr. Nolen here, and I'm going to turn the rest of the time over to her.
Thank you, Lindsay. Let me take a moment to share my screen really quickly. I do have a PowerPoint. I promise not to engage in PowerPoint karaoke here, but it will help keep me on task. And this will also be available to you. I'll send it to Kelly after this session so that you can have access to it after the fact. Lindsay first approached me about speaking and participating in this. I had to check my email. It was back in August of 2019. So it's been a minute. And a lot has happened in the last 21 months since that initial conversation about what this session would entail. And so as a result, over the past 21 months, I've been thinking a lot about this and have had cause to go back and rethink and retool what I was going to say. You know, as the theme indicates, and as Dean Biner mentioned, you know, all of higher education is at an inflection point where we are re-examining all of our processes and our programs, and we're seeing things not necessarily in a new light, but they've been brought into sharper focus as a result of the events of the past 15 months. And so prior to March 2020, when we had the big pivot, online education and face-to-face education existed on two different experiential planes. Those who taught and took classes online, they opted into that. And they did so intentionally, knowing what was going to be asked of them in terms of having access to stable Wi-Fi and webcams and microphones. And most importantly, knowing that that experience is going to require them to engage in self-directed behavior. You know, they're going to have to be in charge of their own learning and their own progress. But then March 2020 happened, and all of that changed to where all of us went online and we didn't have the option. And so those of us who had carefully avoided online teaching and learning suddenly found ourselves having to, you know, jump into the deep end, navigate Zoom or Google Meet, suddenly recognizing how unstable our Wi-Fis were at home. Faculty were learning that their face-to-face classroom instruction and signature pedagogies that they're comfortable with, their activities and their assessments just cannot be replicated in an online environment in the same way. And so they had to figure out how they were going to do what they wanted to do. You're muted became the phrase du jour, followed closely by, can you hear me now? And I'm sharing my screen, can you see it? And Zoom fatigue became not only a part of our lexicon, but it was a really a real source of exhaustion, both for our faculty and our students. So throughout all of that, we have learned some very important lessons about how students engage our courses, how we engage our students, and how much learning is just as much about our emotional states as it is about our cognitive state. And so I want to spend the next several minutes giving you a front row seat into the research from the learning sciences about student motivation, breaking it down into its elemental components and how those components predict engagement, regardless of modality, whether it's face-to-face, online, synchronous, asynchronous, high flex, hybrid, whatever it is that you're choosing, these will apply to that. I also want to give you some insight into what we're still not sure about and what we're still exploring. And then finally, I want to end with a call of action about how you, this vibrant community of scholars and practitioners across legal education, can contribute to that knowledge base. So before I get into all of that, though, again, I'm so glad to be here. And I want to kind of model some of the ways that, some of the principles that I'm going to talk about today and how I use those in my classroom. And so I want to talk a little bit about the chat function. I love a vibrant chat. So, don't hold back, use the chat function. It's not a distraction to me. And it's a great way to give feedback to me about something that's resonating with you, or also ask a question to ask for clarification. And it's also a way to cue each other, to communicate with each other, of maybe providing an example of how something I've talked about, how you've tried the same thing and it worked or it didn't work. And that's another way that we can play with that. And it just adds another dimension to our discussion. I'm going to talk about the chat function a little bit later in terms of how you can use it as a tool for engagement. But I just wanted to give you that permission here. Also, I'm going to use polling, and I'll ask Kelly to launch this poll for you. This is just a couple of questions. I'll ask her to leave it open for a while, and then I'll come back to how we use polls as a tool for engagement as well, and kind of use these questions as kind of a prompt. When I report out the results, it will be aggregate, so you'll be anonymous, so you don't have to feel threatened to participate there as well. Okay. So let me just kind of get into this. And, again, please feel free to ask questions in the chat. So this model that I have on the screen for you, this is going to be the organizer for my talk. In short, motivation leads to engagement, which results in persistence, retention, and achievement. So if you're seeing poor performance, poor persistence, and retention, you can kind of backwards design. What kind of engagement am I seeing? And if you're seeing a lack of engagement, you can dig further down into, okay, what are those elements of motivation that might be missing here? The center of the model, the student engagement, this is where we have all been focused over this past year, because the behaviors that we normally rely on to indicate that students are engaged in a face-to-face class just have not been visible to us, either in synchronous or asynchronous online courses. But as the model indicates, engagement is in and of itself an outcome. And so I want to dig a little deeper into the origin of engagement, which lie in the dimensions of motivation. And these dimensions are significant factors of motivation. And if you are seeing, as I mentioned, if you're seeing a lack of engagement, these dimensions are going to help you to diagnose why, and more importantly, what you can do about it. Student motivation is often mischaracterized, it's misunderstood, and it's often oversimplified as a global individual characteristic, as in he is unmotivated or she is super motivated. But motivation is probably one of the most complicated dynamics, and I use that word intentionally, dynamics, across the learning sciences. And the body of research on this topic spans cognitive psychology, social psychology, educational psychology, my field, neuroscience, and the breadth of educational research. In sum, motivation helps us explain why individuals choose to approach or avoid a task. And once engaged, it explains whether and how they persist and complete the task or just quit, opt out. Why do some students expect to perform better than others? Why do some students persist when confronted with academic obstacles while others do not? Why do some students engage in the class more than others? Why do some students ask questions or seek help, come to office hours, whereas others do not, who clearly are struggling and should? Academic motivation lies at the heart of all of these questions. And it's becoming more important as our classrooms are becoming more diverse, our students' lives are more complicated, and our learning environments are shifting between real time and virtual. Decades of research have revealed that adaptive motivational beliefs and behaviors positively predict engagement, performance, and the continued pursuit of academic interests. So it predicts why and how they re-engage. Yet students often experience a decline in motivation the longer that they remain in school. And many academic contexts also disproportionately undermine motivation, especially for historically underrepresented students. Therefore, motivation continues to be an essential area of work because it is such a critical precursor to achievement-related behaviors. And it's important in its own right. It's crucial for educators across all settings, all levels, to create learning environments, face-to-face, online, hybrid, in which students inherently value learning and are transformed by that experience. So given the importance of motivation in education, it's unsurprising that research on this topic has just bloomed over the past 50 years. And there are 5 major academic motivation theories that have inspired and guided all of this work. I don't have the time here to pick apart those 5 theories for you. That's an entire semester's worth of content. But I've been able to distill those essential elements that are present across all 5 theories. These theories focus on the beliefs, the values, the needs, and the goals that students adopt in achievement settings. They also point to the importance of the role of the instructor and the characteristics of the learning environment that embrace these values. And so here is what I'm calling just a general model of motivation that bridges all of the 5 major theories and again distills them into these 5 dimensions. I like to think of these as values that I embrace as I design my courses, regardless of modality. And I have to find a way that these values are reflected in the content, in the activities that I provide, in the layout of my course, and in how I assess learning. And so I'm going to walk through each of these dimensions, excuse me, and talk about how I embrace them and how I act around these dimensions and design elements of my courses. And then again, this is a great opportunity with each of these as you see your practice reflected in what I'm talking about, put it in the chat, show your peers, this is how I've used this, or this is how I've done this. And again, this is a great way to kind of engage on this other level. So the first value is one of competency. Students come into every learning environment with a set of beliefs and expectations about their own competency. Those beliefs and expectations have a direct influence on how they engage their instructor, their content, and the environment. Those students with higher levels of competence are more likely to achieve success. And not only do they have a high level of competence, but as a result of that, they have a high level of confidence. And so the research around this has shown that students with a high level of competence are more likely to engage in help-seeking behaviors. They're more likely to ask questions in class, to seek clarification. They're more likely to come see you during office hours. And all of this feels a little counterintuitive because we think, well, if a student has some sense of a lack of sense of competence, surely they should be the one to seek out clarification and support. Yes, that's true. However, these students tend to mask that incompetence, and they mask it by withholding questions because they assume that by asking questions in class, they're signaling to their instructor and to their peers of their own incompetence. They're signaling by coming to office hours that they have some incompetence. And so what they do is they withhold the question and just hope that someone else is going to ask the question for them. Students might have a lower level of competency, not because they don't have the skill or knowledgeability, but because they have experienced messaging in prior environments that have shaken their confidence. So I have to think about what my learning space looks like with an eye towards this reality, that my students are, for example, coming out of structures of inequality that shape their belief system about their capability even before they have entered my class or entered the program. If I'm not designing my class, especially an online class, with that realization in mind, then it's not likely to be a successful experience for that student. So I think of this in terms of how I make myself accessible to my students, both in the learning space and outside the learning space. How do I normalize help-seeking behaviors so that the student does not feel threatened that by merely asking a question, they're signaling their own incompetence? What barriers do I need to identify and remove for students to connect with me early? And one of the things that I've started this year that I'm definitely going to continue post-pandemic is what I call virtual student hours. So I've reframed office hours from a time that's traditionally reserved for struggling students to come to me for help to student hours, which is when I meet with each student to talk about how they are connecting with the student. It serves the same purpose, but the messaging normalizes that behavior. The messaging suggests this is what successful students do. This is what competent students do. And so then I'm pulling more students in. These are held on Zoom, they're virtual, and they sign up for a time with me on my academic Google Calendar. And so they don't have to come to campus, they don't have to park or find my office, and they don't have to stand outside my office worried that they're going to interrupt me. So I've removed all those barriers. And as a result, I have had more interaction with my students this past year than in all the years combined leading up to it. And so this is definitely something that I'm going to include. Another strategy is just creating, this is especially important for asynchronous online courses, creating a welcome video that this is the first thing they see when they log into the course. And it's just you introducing yourself and who you are, but also how you approach the course, and also identifying here are some anticipated problem areas that you're going to encounter. I know that these are going to be pieces of content that you're going to struggle with because I've seen it. I've taught this course before. I know where students are going to struggle, but don't worry, I have a plan for that. I know you're going to struggle here. I have support for you. So that way the student, when they do meet that point, especially a student who's wrestling with their own competency and they reach a point of challenge, they think, oh, okay, I'm supposed to struggle here. I'm supposed to be challenged here. And so again, it normalizes that. Let me move to the next one, meaningfulness. Students evaluate every task as having value, importance, or usefulness, and they're going to engage in those tasks accordingly. And this value is not a fixed state. It's going to vary by student, by time and place. And so a task might have intrinsic value for a student, a value that is the anticipated enjoyment that they're going to experience from just doing the task. They're doing it because they just love doing it. But a task might also have utility value, in which a student recognizes how well a particular task is going to help them in a short-term or long-term goal. I'm going to do this thing because it's going to help me pass this course. I'm going to do this thing because it's going to help prepare me for the bar. I'm going to do this thing because it helps me get a better internship placement, etc. This particular dimension is pretty important one because it gets to the root of student engagement, or what we think of as student engagement. And in fact, many of the researchers who have contributed to the 5 major theories have identified meaningfulness as a core value. So when I'm designing my class, again, regardless of modality, but particularly for online courses, I keep this value in mind. And I work really hard to help students situate every activity, every assignment and group project and assessment within a larger perspective. This is not something that I can define for them. I cannot define the value, the utility value, or the intrinsic value for the student. They have to define it themselves. But as the instructor, I can help them do that. I can press them on it and query it with them. And my students trust me that if I ask them to do something, to take a risk, to be uncomfortable with the content, that it's because I'm hoping that they'll find some value in it, that they'll experience value. So in other words, I'm not going to have them do busy work. I'm not going to have them do work that is inconsequential. Everything that is in my class that I have them engage in is intentional and is intentionally designed and prompting them to find value and relevance for that. Related to this is the cost of doing that task, in contrast with the value that they've identified. So the learner is constantly evaluating that cost benefit. And this evaluation will have a significant effect on whether or not they engage in a task or pursue a goal, or re-engage after the fact. So this cost can be everything from how much effort it takes for me to complete a task, to complete an assignment, to complete an assessment. It can also include opportunity cost, which is the extent to which engaging in one task prevents me from engaging in this other, also valued task. It can also include the emotional cost, which is the anticipated anxiety or the social cost of possibly failing when success isn't assured or guaranteed. And so this is a really interesting value that gets to the heart of the learning climate in the class that you design. What are the costs, the implicit or explicit costs in your courses? Are my students so afraid of failure that they engage in strategies that are fail-safe? The what do I need to do to get an A approach, which Ken Bain refers to as strategic learning, which is temporary. They do just what they need to do to get what they need, and then often that learning dissipates, and so it doesn't ensure a deep learning that we're striving for. The way to embrace this value is to create learning environments where students genuinely feel safe to take a risk. Joshua Eiler, in his book, How Humans Learn, published in 2018, and this is a great book. It distills the neuroscience behind learning into practical insights to teaching. And I have the research or the resource in my PowerPoint, so you'll be able to access it there. He devotes an entire chapter to failure and describing how important failure is to learning. But this is tricky because for some students, failure has a lot higher stakes. They have been marginalized throughout their educational experience. And so if I say, I want you to not be afraid to fail, I'm telling them something that is completely different than everything they have been told up until that point. And I'm asking them to take a risk. Then the onus is on me, the instructor, to provide for that student a safety net, a soft place to land, if you will. So if they take a chance and it doesn't pan out, I will require them to reflect on what they did, how and why it didn't work, what they could have done differently, and then I give them another opportunity. Or I might design activities or assignments in which failure is baked in. They can just anticipate it. So in courses where you have exams, students could have the opportunity when they get their exam back to revise and resubmit to earn back some of the points that they lost. So not only do they rehabilitate their grade after unsatisfactory performance, but also again, I incorporate an opportunity to reflect on either the strategy that they used to prepare for the exam that didn't work, or the content itself. Why is this response, why are you, what is your motive for changing this particular response in this way? So really having them reflect on the content. The next two values, these are the last two of the five, I think are subtle, but I think really important. Value number 4 is autonomy. The extent to which the learner perceives that they have agency in their own learning, that they have some choice in what they engage in and how they engage in it. They have choice in the pathways that they choose. When learners have control over their learning, they make choices, then they're able to connect their performance with the choices that they make. There's an intention there. And choice and flexibility have been so important to us over the last year for all of us. We've demonstrated that we can be flexible. We can be flexible with our grading schemes when we pivoted to credit, no credit for many of us. We're flexible with our due dates. We've even explored how flexible we can be with course modalities by experimenting with hybrid or high flex courses, where students choose the mode for attendance for that particular day or topic. And then they're able to move back and forth as life happens or circumstances change. I think there's even discussion about there was some flexibility around high stakes assessments and whether it's the GRE or the LSAT or ACT or even the bar exam, just some flexibility in how students were able to engage those and how those are used. When students know that they have access to multiple pathways to a goal, that if one pathway gets obstructed, then they can easily jump onto another pathway. And they're more likely to persist in the face of challenges, particularly unanticipated challenges. And many of our students live lives of precarity where they don't necessarily have control over all the things that are happening in their background. And so this is just a way to be able to accommodate the complexity of our students' lives that I think moving forward, we have to learn from this past year of how this flexibility worked, where it worked, and how we can sustain that when there's not a pandemic in play. The final dimension or value is relatedness. And this is one of the most overlooked, but I think one of the most important aspects of the learning environment. It's the forming and maintaining of close and secure relationships within a learning space. It's building community. It's also often referred to in the context of belongingness. Belonging in an academic environment refers to an individual's sense of fit, that they fit in with the people, the activities, the materials that are present in the space. And students are going to assess their belonging by asking questions related to how well they belong. They're going to ask, are there people here whom I can connect with? Do people here value people who look like me? Can I be successful here? Are there cues evident to inform those questions? And students who don't see themselves reflected in the curriculum or in the complexions and lived experiences of their instructors or peers will struggle to develop a sense of belonging or place in that learning space. However, there's a growing body of research on belonging that suggests that the instructor is an important support, and as a result is a significant mediating variable. The instructor can disrupt narratives of uncertainty, leading students to a greater sense of belonging and engagement in the learning environment. And so as a value that I incorporate into my classes, I focus on this relationship, that dialogical relationship that focuses on the wholeness of the individual. I recognize that my students come into my class as full and complicated human beings, and that my course is just one facet of their daily lives and experiences. And by demonstrating that recognition of them as a whole person in all of their complexity, I'm demonstrating interest and respect and concern for my students. When instructors show those values, students then in turn show a significant increase in self-esteem, in competency, there's that word again, and they take increased responsibility for their own learning. But this is one of the biggest challenges of online courses, especially asynchronous courses. Students continually report a sense of isolation or aloneness in these online courses, a feeling of being disconnected from instructors and each other. And I think as instructors, we feel that too. And so, the question begs then, how can we build online learning environments in which students can connect with each other, where we can create community? And how can we provide experiences where students can build collaborative relationships and learn from each other? I want to spend a moment here because there are specific things that you can do, and these are just small behaviors. Obviously, over the past year, this has been front and center of a concern for us, is how do we get students engaged in these online courses? The research that's being conducted is still in the preliminary stage that we've been doing over this past year. But these are just some preliminary things that we know from prior research that work and that we can leverage to build community. The first one, and this is for asynchronous courses, is to build and implement several short videos throughout the course. And so I mentioned the role of that introductory welcome video and what that could do for setting the stage and kind of laying out the tone and creating a welcoming environment. But other ways to use these videos is you can use them to debrief after a discussion thread. We know that a heavy instructor presence in the discussion thread actually flattens the discussion. So we have to walk a fine line of how much we want to be present in that discussion thread. I jump into discussion threads to give the prompt. I jump in occasionally to kind of get people back on topic if necessary, but I really let the students dig into the prompt and the deep learning. But then at the end of the week or end of a time period, I will post a short debriefing video where I talk about the discussion and I'll point out, oh, so-and-so made this really great point about X, Y, or Z. Let me elaborate on that a little bit. Or this other person gave a really great example. Let's explore that a little further. Or here's a topic or here's an issue that nobody seemed to cover, but I think is really important, and let me tell you why, and so forth and so on. And so you can use these videos to engage the students around the discussion, to help shape the discussion. I also use these videos, brief videos, to debrief after assignments or quizzes, projects, exams, as a class level feedback. So I give them individualized feedback on the actual artifact. And here I'm going to go reference back to that issue of belongingness and competency. So students who are confident, who have a strong sense of competency, they use feedback very differently than students who do not have those characteristics. So if I'm confident in my learning and I feel like I belong in this space, I feel entitled to be in this space. When I get feedback from my instructor, I'm going to process it like this is constructive. This is a tool I'm going to use to improve my performance for the next time. But if I'm wrestling with whether or not I belong in that space in the first place, I'm wrestling with my own incompetence, I'm going to take that exact same feedback, but I'm going to internalize it and see it as further evidence of why I don't belong. And so it kind of puts me in this negative spiral, a kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy, if you will. So I'm going to give them that individualized feedback, but then I'm going to post a class level video, very brief, where I talk about, here are some common errors that I saw. Here are some common strengths that I saw. Here's further examples of how you could have approached this particular task. And so the student who might be wrestling, again, with their sense of competence or belonging, they'll see themselves reflected in that class level feedback. I'm normalizing error. I'm normalizing flaw or failure. And so they'll see, oh, it's not just me. Everyone is doing it this way. Okay. And so they begin to see themselves in relative to the larger class. For synchronous classes, when we talk about engagement, often we think about the camera issue. And so this is a class that I taught last summer, so cameras can be a good indicator of engagement or a good way to have students engaging. But it's a touchy issue as to whether or not to require the camera being on. I'm very sensitive to the very legitimate reasons why students might not want to have their cameras on. They might not live in as nice of a space as their peers. They just don't want to show that. They might be living with family members for whom they want to respect their privacy. They might not have a stable enough Wi-Fi to be able to sustain video, or they're engaging the class from their car outside of a Wendy's where they're kind of taking advantage of their Wi-Fi. But this is an opportunity to have this conversation with the class at the beginning of the course, where you can engage them in a discussion about what is the role of the camera here, and when do we feel comfortable using it? When would it be appropriate to use the camera? And then engage them in what they think is an important opportunity to use the camera or not. And so you can identify times when maybe it's not important to use the camera. So when we're engaging in this particular activity, I'm going to give you permission to turn your cameras off. Let's all just turn our cameras off. But then also identify activities or instances where, as a collective, you've decided this is an important opportunity for us to use our cameras. And so when possible, encouraging each other to use the camera. But again, it's a very sensitive issue, and it's not one that I will impose upon my students. It's one that I broach with them with sensitivity, and we discuss as a whole. Again, by talking about it as a whole, that's another way that we establish a sense of community. And I have them, just really reflect on, the cost and benefit of having those cameras on. Before I come to this, let me talk just briefly about face-to-face classes. I also want to give equal opportunity here. In face-to-face classes, one of the easiest and most straightforward ways that you can help create community is to learn and use each other's names. It's as simple as that. Over the past year, I have really come to rely on the Zoom that provides the name for me. So I haven't had to memorize as much or rely on my memory as much as I've had in the past. And I'm worried about this next fall when I go back into the classroom and I have 30 students in front of me, my ability to memorize their names quickly. But that is an easy way to just, again, begin to establish that relationship with the students, because it says, I see you, I respect you enough to call you by the name that you prefer or the pronouns that you prefer. And so that's just one easy way to do that. So all of these values that I've talked about, these 5 dimensions of motivation, these are all relevant across all the different learning spaces, whether that's a traditional classroom or a Zoom breakout room, or in a hybrid situation or in a discussion board. The visible manifestation of the interplay of these 5 dimensions is student engagement. So when the degree to which a student is engaged depends on that dynamic interplay between their sense of their competence, their assessment of the meaningfulness of the content, the cost of engaging, their sense of agency or autonomy, and how much they relate to others in that space. Over the years, I have interacted with a lot of faculty across many disciplines, as well as teachers across K-12. And if I've heard it once, I've heard it 1,000 times. My students are just not engaged. And they talk about it as though it's a part of the student's character, it's part of their very DNA. However, I tell them if they were a fly on the shoulder of that student and followed them throughout the day, they were going to witness many instances throughout their day when they are very engaged. So every time I hear that, I challenge that person to complete the sentence. My students are not engaged in the learning environment that I have created for them. And by completing the sentence in that way, it does 3 things. First, it takes the entire responsibility of engagement off the shoulders of the student. Secondly, it brings the instructor into that frame. The instructor is an active agent in developing the framing of the learning content, setting the parameters of the learning environment. And then finally, by seeing yourself, the instructor, as part of that dynamic, that means that you can do something about it. You can change the framing, change the messaging, change the parameters, change the stakes. Doing any and all of that are going to change the way that students are engaging that environment. So let's talk about student engagement. What is it? What does it look like? When we think about student engagement, we often default to what engagement looks like in the traditional classroom setting. So we're going to start there. And this is where I'm going to prompt you to put something in the chat. I want you, and don't put anything in the chat yet. I want you to identify, think back to the before times, before March 2020, and you're standing in front of a classroom. And I want you to think of a specific behavior that indicates to you that a student is engaged. Think of that behavior. And then I want you to write that behavior in the chat right now. And I'll wait. Eye contact, yes. Head nodding, yes. Speaking, yes. The furrowed brow, yes. Note taking, asking questions, answering questions, yes. I refer to this as a chat-a-lanch or a chat explosion, or have everybody chatting at the same time. So read over these are all, yes, these are all behaviors that we rely on in a face-to-face interaction to indicate to us, but also indicate to each other that they are engaged, that they are tracking you, or that they have a question or are confused or seeking clarification, all of which are indicators of engagement. And just like motivation, there are different dimensions to student engagement. There's behavioral engagement, which is what we look for, and this is what you're describing, this behavior that they're indicating. But there's also emotional engagement, which is the positive emotion or the value of learning, the interest in the content. That's not necessarily visible to you. There's also cognitive engagement, which is how a student regulates their own learning, their strategy of approaching a challenge or content. So while it's possible for a student to be behavioral engaged, they may they may not be behaviorally engaged. They may be cognitively or emotionally engaged. And it's important to go beyond just those visible signs. So what does engagement look like online, where I can't necessarily see whether they're taking notes or nodding, or I can't see the furrowed brow, either because the tile isn't visible to me, or they don't have their cameras on, or it's asynchronous. So this is much more challenging as a result. Eye contact doesn't mean the same thing. Making eye contact means I'm looking into the camera, which means I'm not looking at you, which your face is down here, or I can't see my notes, or I can't see the chat, and so it doesn't mean the same thing. That we have to find other ways. So let's take a moment now, and as we are thinking about online classroom, whether it's asynchronous or asynchronous, what is a behavior, and envision this first before you put in the chat, what is a behavior or an action that they do that indicates that they're engaged in an online class? And then put that in the chat. A raised hand. Chatting. Polling, right? Reacting to each other. Small group discussion. Yeah. It's definitely more challenging. And the behaviors become more, it's just harder to think of what those behaviors are. And it's easier to think of it in a synchronous environment than an asynchronous, where the field even becomes narrower. So keep adding those. Those are great. The different ways that students can engage in an online course are actually more varied than in a face-to-face, because in an online class, we can speak, we can write, we can vote, we can work in groups, and we can show our work. Now, all of those are available to us in a face-to-face class, but in a face-to-face class, we tend to default to the speaking. And that degrades in an online environment for a variety of reasons. But in an online class, whether it's synchronous or asynchronous, we can use all of these tools that our LMS provides for us, LMS being Blackboard or any of the other platforms we use. So, again, if I'm in a classroom, there are just different ways that I can ask students to, there are only so many ways that the student is going to feel comfortable participating. But in online, I can ask students to participate in the chat. And here, let me talk about the chat for a moment. So, as we've been indicating here, there's this important dialogue that's happening, that's adding a dimension to the discussion that we don't allow in a face-to-face class. We don't allow these side conversations happening because it's very distracting, but it's not interfering here. And it's actually adding to the instruction, it's adding to the environment. I talk with my students about how to use the chat, and we develop signals to each other. So one of the things that we do, and I'll put it here, is when students hear something from me that resonates with them, they do a shift 6, a caret. Just that. That's a proxy for nodding or eye contact. If they hear something that they really like, they do 2 carets. If they hear something that is just blowing their mind, they will hear, you'll see this, right? And so that's just confirming for me that, okay, they're tracking me, they're following along, this is resonating with them, but they're also communicating to each other. If you're in a class with other students, and again, especially if you're worried about your own level of competency, you're looking to other students to normalize what you're hearing. And so if students are expressing confusion, just simply like this, then students will say, oh, okay, I'm not the only one. I'm not the only person who's confused here. And so students, can create this kind of shorthand way of communicating with you and communicating with each other that just, again, adds to the environment that replicates that kind of engagement in the classroom. Polling. So polling is another tool that I use. So Kelly, if you could show the results of the poll for everyone so that they took at the beginning. Okay. So polling is a really interesting tool because it allows you to learn what your students are thinking in a very efficient manner. I am struck by the number of times when what I think, when I thought I knew what my students are thinking is not at all what my students are thinking. So it's a useful tool for me, and I can conduct pre-assessments to get a sense of what how my students are thinking about the content even before we engage in the discussion. Or I can use the polling as a tool to instill a sense of autonomy or choice making, where we can talk about how, what would you like to talk about next week? Of these 3 things, what would you like to tackle first? So you're giving them an opportunity to choose, or they can choose an activity or something like that. They can also use them as just knowledge clicks, like clicker technology, to check for understanding. And it also helps the students to understand what they know and what they don't know, because it gives them immediate feedback that would ordinarily take much longer to try to do any other way. Polling requires, it's different than hand raising. So if you're in a face-to-face class and you ask, okay, show of hands, who thinks this? Students are influenced by the behaviors of those around them. So they're going to look around and say, okay, who's raising their hand, who's not? And they're going to wait, and they're going to raise their hand when everyone else is, because they don't want to be the only one. Polling takes that influence out of it. So they don't know who's raising their hand when, and so you get a truer sense of what they're thinking. And also by committing to a response, they're more likely going to want to defend it. So that gives you another way of engaging them around the content. You can engage in a kind of debate about why did you choose this and not that? And they're going to, again, it's going to stimulate another level of discussion there. And so, the questions that I asked you all, they're pretty straightforward. They're not, tricky in any way. And you can see the experience that students had in their teaching prior to March 2020. The plurality of you had only taught in a face-to-face classroom. So I would imagine that big pivot was quite jarring for a lot of you. You can see their perception about student engagement in across the different modalities and their assessment of student engagement. And so a lot of you saw lower levels of engagement. And, and I'm going to be very and I hope you will too, be very forgiving with yourself over this past year. Not only did you have to navigate and learn a completely new modality, but you had to do so with the backdrop of a pandemic and Black Lives Matter protest and how all of that kind of disrupted our environments. And so there were a lot of external factors that were influencing whether or not students were engaged. And so, I hope you can be very, very forgiving with yourself as a result. But these are just ways that you can use polls to, again, give different pathways into engaging in an online environment. Another one, I'll speak very quickly about this because I want to be very sensitive about our time, is breakout rooms. The use of breakout rooms is a great tool, especially if you have a large class, because it shrinks the class for the student. It shrinks the experience into something much more intimate. But it takes a lot of planning. And they're hard to use on the fly. You really have to be intentional about it, about how you want to use it and plan for it. There are two common errors that instructors make when using breakout rooms. The first one is they don't give clear instructions to the students about what they're supposed to do and what deliverable they're supposed to bring back from that breakout room. So they get into the breakout room and they're like, I don't know what we're supposed to do. Let's try to figure this out. And 10 minutes have gone by, and once they figure it out, they only have a couple minutes left, which leads me to my next point. And that is the second error that instructors make is they don't give them enough time in the breakout room. In a face-to-face class, when we ask students to divide up into groups, they'll often go into groups with people who are sitting around them. Most likely they know those students. And most likely, not only do they know those students, but those students share their same perspective or ideas about the content. So when they get into the breakout room or into their smaller groups, they can dispense with all of that introductory stuff. I already know you. I don't need to introduce myself to you. We can just dive right into the content. And so they're much more efficient. But in online breakout rooms, particularly for large classes, those are usually randomly sorted. So students will go into a breakout room with students that they might not know or have never interacted with before. So they have to do that introductory work of, this is who I am, who are you, where are you in your program, what do you think about this? Hopefully you've given them very clear instructions so they don't have to navigate that too. But again, it takes them a little bit longer to get into that deep work that you're hoping to achieve in those breakout rooms. So just give them clear instructions and sufficient amount of time. The final thing that I want to talk about, just something to put on your radar here with respect to online learning. Whether you're using Blackboard or Canvas or any other LMS, those learning management systems collect a lot of data around student engagement in online settings. So they collect data logs. And those could be used as a way to observe student engagement behaviors without interfering with the student and with little effort on your part. So you can determine or you can peek into how much time a student is spending on a particular page, or how many times they participate in a discussion, or how many times they viewed a particular video, or when a student begins an activity relative to its due date. Do they start it a week out, or do they start it 12 hours before it's due? Those are important indicators to you, and it helps set the context. The LMS data also captures day and time when students are accessing different kinds of content, which helps you plan as to, okay, when are they accessing it the most? When are they accessing it the least? So that you know when they're most active in the LMS, so you don't kind of miss that wave if you're trying to push something out to them. And so all of these data points are proxies for behavioral, cognitive, and emotional engagement. But there's a limitation to this type of data that I think you need to be aware of, and that this type of, that the construct of engagement is more complex than the data would suggest. So simply spending more time on an activity or on an assignment doesn't necessarily mean positive student engagement. So you just kind of have to put it in a broader context of that student's overall performance. But I encourage you to, take full advantage of what these platforms can provide you, and even use them in your face-to-face course. Use them as offloading resources and ways of engaging students outside of class. You have them in front of you 3 hours. There's another 168 hours of the week when you want them to connect. And so this is a way that you can provide a platform for them to connect. So I want to conclude with just some guiding questions as you progress through the remainder of this conference, and then end with a couple of caveats here. With the increase of online and blended learning across higher education, it was only a matter of time before this issue came knocking at the door of legal education. And so, I'm excited that you're devoting these next couple of days to really explore the problems and issues and strategies of enhancing your online learning environments and how you can kind of leverage those to increase student retention and persistence. All too often, online courses and online programs show high attrition rates, failure, frequent failure of students to thrive and persist, especially when they meet academic challenges. And a major contributing factor or cause of that is just an inadequate understanding regarding what the student is bringing into those settings, their beliefs, their values, and the needs when you're designing these online experiences and online environments. So the values that I've laid out here foster motivation, which lead to student engagement. They're universal across modalities, but perhaps are more important in online courses where students experience isolation and aloneness, and thus they might require additional support. So as you're attending the subsequent sessions, I want to, I hope you have these 5 values kind of humming in the background, and you are thinking about these guiding questions. How can we, as a community of scholars and practitioners, create environments where help-seeking behaviors are normalized and not seen as a weakness or incompetence? How can we help students meaningfully connect with the content? How can we create safe learning spaces and experiences where students can experiment, take risks, and be creative in their process without fear of failure? How can we provide multiple pathways to success in our courses from which students can choose? They can choose in terms of how to attend, how to participate, and even in their assessments, how they are assessed. And then finally, how can we create collaborative experiences for learning that support all of these values? These are big questions. And there's no single correct answer, as we've discussed. But by having these in, front and center means that you are attending to the complexity of the student and the lives that they lead. And so here I have to leave with these 2 caveats. So, based on everything that I've said, the majority of the research conducted over the past 50 years that informs this work was conducted on predominantly white, able-bodied populations by predominantly white, able-bodied research. When we begin to examine the role of disability and race and the cultural meaning and expectations in academic structures and settings, those in my field are worried that we may not be asking the right questions, or we may be missing an important variable in explaining how motivation leads to engagement resulting in performance. And that needs more research, and it needs honest discussions about historical marginalizations that students with disabilities and students of color have experienced across educational systems and institutions. Secondly, law schools, as well as graduate level programs, medical schools, PhD programs, you all benefit from a survival bias that can distort the manner in which motivation manifests in active student engagement. And what I mean by that is that most of what we know about motivation and engagement is from research on a general population of students. It's what I call the big middle. Across these populations is a wide variety of aptitude, achievement, and experience. So recent US Department of Education data finds that at kindergarten, 95% of kindergartners exhibit strong motivational profiles with high levels of engagement. They are excited. They love school. But by the time they leave elementary school, just 6 years later, that drops to 37%. If and when they make it to graduate high school, that drops even further to 28%. Most students endure school, but they're not happy about it. But this explains why 96% of the US population has a high school degree, but only 32% have a college degree at the bachelor's level. And then only 9% have a master's degree or higher. So it's a unique student who decides to re-engage again and again and make it to law school and persist in law school to seek out that academic challenge. So your typical law student has already demonstrated highly adapted behaviors and has sustained them through K through 16. But we need to know more about these students and advanced graduate students in general. We need to know how motivation and engagement behaviors manifest in these highest levels of educational attainment. And this is where you come in. And this is my call to action, and it's my final point. The fact that you are here participating in this conference tells me that you are interested in this topic. You all have a focus on teaching and learning practices to improve legal education, improve the student experience, improve the learning and the persistence, and what that looks like across the different modalities. You have a community of practitioners and scholars who can explore the praxis of motivational theory as instructional practice, using law schools as laboratories for the scholarship of teaching and learning in your field. And so I hope that you will consider collaborating with each other across this conference, as well as your colleagues from the learning sciences or academies for teaching and learning, or at your respective institutions, to explore how small changes, small interventions can result in large learning outcomes. And so I'm going to leave that there. It's a big call to action, but it's one that's definitely needed, that we just need access. The reason that this research isn't there is because this is a much smaller, cloistered group of students that, as the typical learning scientists, we just don't have access to them. You do. And you have the interest, and this is a great opportunity to really explore that and improve these experiences for your students and for your faculty. So I'm going to stop there. Thank you all very much. And I am reading through all of these as we're talking, but we have a few minutes left. And so if you have a specific question or a comment, you can put it in the chat, or you can raise your hand, and we can kind of talk about it there. So let me stop my sharing, And there we go. Okay, so the floor is yours. Okay, Nicole Foster has a question.
Hi, it's not a question, it's a
Oh.
comment. Thanks very much. I'm from sunny Barbados saying hello. I'm really sorry I joined late because I had student advising, but I really enjoyed this session. But I wanted to just make a quick comment about the last questions, those guiding questions that you put up, and a few of them really resonated with me. And in particular, the one about creating safe spaces for students to feel comfortable being creative and failing. And what the experience I wanted to share was that that's such a challenge in the context of the culture that we have certainly here right now in terms of our educational system.
Yes.
I did an experiment with my students, as I said, from some other training that I had done, this whole idea of giving students a choice about what they could do as their final assessment. So normally our assessments are, your typical written paper, problem-based analysis, apply your case law analysis, etc. And so I said to them, we're going online, we can do anything we like, give me your input, be creative, I'm looking for all of these creative ideas. And they came up with exactly the same way that they're always assessed. And similarly, when I say to them, what do you think about something? Or, I say, please feel free to challenge me. You realize that they really feel intimidated, not necessarily by me, but they're just not accustomed to this idea that they get a choice and, so they fall back to what is comfortable. I mean, I ended up making a choice that was different to what I would normally do, which is I gave them an academic poster or video and said, you choose between those two. And so I tried to be creative in that way, but still give them some choice. But I realized from that interaction with them that we, even as you create a safe space in your classroom, perhaps, or try to, there's so much socialization that these students have had in terms of our overall educational system that it really is a long-term goal in terms of making them feel comfortable enough to have an individual view that is different from the lecturers, but also to feel comfortable enough that everything doesn't have to work out. And so, you are allowed to be creative and make a suggestion about something, and maybe it will work, but maybe it won't, but actually it's a good thing if we work through that together.
Yeah.
I just wanted to share that.
That's an excellent comment. And, as I mentioned, even just posing the question of, that taking a risk is something that many students, they've just never heard before. And so it is, you touched on it beautifully, it is part of the culture. And changing culture is really challenging and is a long game, right? And so it's just doing those little messaging a little bit at a time, and over time they begin to trust that, oh, you do mean it. When you say I can take a risk and it's not gonna tank my status, it just takes some relationship building. Yeah. There's a question in the comment. There are two, Steve and Jennifer. I'm going to kind of combine those. How do you evaluate a diverse class's competency at the beginning and ongoing in legal education? And I would love more directed conversation about the lowest performing students and enhancing their motivation specifically. Those are big questions. So how to, assessment is an ongoing, it's iterative, and I think of it as a conversation. And so at the beginning, prior to assessment, prior to instruction, you do a lot of pre-assessment to find out where are they in relationship to the content. What knowledge are they bringing in with them? And this is where you can use concept inventories. You can, just engage them in just Q&A. But I think really taking in, how have they transferred the knowledge that they're bringing from other courses into your course? And if you're seeing common areas where they are lacking, there's a transition issue. There's a pipeline issue into your course that you can address, but that takes some data collection over time. And so really track that. And then, that ongoing feedback, that ongoing dialogue that you're having with students individually. And again, this gets to even the lowest performing students, again, who are probably those most in need of that kind of structure or support and scaffolding, is to engage, normalize the errors so that they're not engaging in that kind of self-defeating, self-fulfilling prophecy, but that they can see, okay, here's the strategy I need to take to improve my performance. And again, this is probably the most controversial thing I'll say today, is creating a collaborative environment where students can feel safe, where students can really have honest assessment of their own performance, doesn't happen in competitive learning environments. And and so when you have an environment where students feel like they're competing with each other, all of this is undermined, all of it. And so really striving to have collaborative environments that are student-centered, where you're starting where the student is and then moving them along to where they're seeing themselves in relationship to the criteria you've designed for them, not necessarily the performance of their peers. And I recognize that might be controversial in this setting, but the research is very clear about those kinds of academic goals that we set for students and the impact those have on even the lowest performing students and their ability to thrive.
I am going to
Amanda, my
quickly.
observation is that in U.S. legal system, it's an adversarial system, and the law schools in many states and many other considerations train students to be adversarial. I don't necessarily agree with that, but what you just said might be at odds with that type of understanding that is promoted in certain law schools to the students. And that is noticed when you especially transfer from one law school, let's say Harvard Law, to the University of Arkansas. You may find that the students have a different viewpoint than what collaboration may mean. So I've seen that, and it's interesting to combine the total experience, learning experience, and mold that into a class lesson plan that benefits all students from a diverse standpoint. And I also mentioned that a student doesn't necessarily have to enter the adversarial aspect of law. The student can enter transactional law, such as tax law, for instance. So you give students an opportunity to participate and learn while at the same time having the flexibility to pursue the legal career that makes the most sense for them, based on competently evaluating the students in the beginning and in an ongoing manner.
I am going to hop in here really quickly. We have reached the end of this session. Amanda, thank you so much. This has been fantastic. We really, really appreciate your expertise. Thank you, attendees, for the robust conversation in the chat comments. It's been fascinating to read your questions and input. We've got on the schedule a couple of minutes break, so if you need to refill the coffee or grab another Diet Coke, the concurrent sessions will start at the top of the hour, and we have 2 tracks. They're odd numbered, even numbers, so you can pick which Zoom link you'd like to join for the next session that starts at the top of the hour. And Amanda, again, thank you very much.
My pleasure. I enjoyed it. Thank you all.
Just keep smiling, Amanda. It only gets better. And I guess we can still go refill our Tom Collins if we want to, if we had enough coffee this morning, right? And laughter is the best medicine.
It's a little early for the Tom Collins.
I think that's very important. So I'll see everybody at the next session. Thanks.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.